Hello and welcome to this video on correlation, rules, and policy with the Cisco Secure Firewall. I'm Alex Tadashev, a technical marketing engineer with Cisco Systems. So I wanted to make this video to try and increase the understanding and maybe even the usage of a feature that's been in this firewall for some time, going back to the SourceFire days, and that is correlation, rules, and policy. So what is correlation? What does that mean? What does it do? It's basically an if this then that function within the secure firewall. So you can take an event that takes place and then do something in response to it. Usually that's just send an alert. So the idea is you can respond in real time to threats. What's very exciting about this particular feature is if you have something that's happening that's taking a long time to play out, like a data exfiltration event, for instance, those don't happen in seconds. Those happen usually minutes or hours or even days where data is siphoned off the network. You can actually respond while those are happening. If you have a connection that's taking a few minutes to transfer a lot of data, you can trigger an alert during that connection, not wait till it's over. You can also alert for specific event types or specific hosts or specific users. So everyone has the more high value targets on their network or in their environment. So I'm talking high value targets such as servers or hosts out there that have sensitive data on them. Users, which are targets for attacks, such as maybe your executives or system administrators. These are good targets for malware or for threat actors to try to compromise, because if I can get a system administrator's password, I probably have a lot more privileges, maybe even domain admin, which is huge. And the last thing on this slide, network traffic conditions. This is really exciting because you can write a rule to look for the specific conditions which might be surrounding a certain type of an exploit or an attack. So you don't have to know exactly what the attack looks like. You don't have to have a signature rule or a snort rule with a vulnerability attached that we know about beforehand. You can say, I'm going to look for these particular conditions in a network connection, and if I see that, I want to trigger an alert for that. So why do we have correlation? I mean, you have snort rules, right? We have security intelligence, we have file and malware, we have lots of things. Well, anything that's signature based is limited. Signatures look for specific bytes maybe or strings or a specific attribute in an attack, right? So you have to know what you're looking for to find it. Now, to be clear, signature based detection works great. It's the primary method most security devices use today to detect malicious activity or malware. However, even though signatures get distributed rather quickly after an event happens, they still are fairly useless against something like a zero-day attack. You can't stop what you don't know about yet. Snort rules are, I don't like to call them signatures, I call them rules, not signatures, because they can be written and should be written to look for conditions. So if you're talking about looking for a vulnerable condition in software, that may be something where a buffer overflow exists in a certain function if you send more than 100 characters of data to it, for instance. A rule, a snort rule in that case, would look for the presence of more than 100 bytes of data being sent to that function. We don't care what's in the data. We just know that if you send more than 100, that's vulnerable. It's going to cause an overflow. So that's what I mean by rule-based. So it's better than signature-based because any type of attack that sends more than 100 bytes to that function is going to trigger the rule. So we don't have to look inside the attack and see a specific signature. We just have to look for the conditions. But again, you still have to know what the conditions are. The vulnerability has to be there. You have to have a rule for it. Rules do operate across multiple attack vectors, and we've actually had rules that triggered on new attacks, even though they're written for older attacks because the vulnerability was similar, but still require pre-knowledge. Correlation rules at the bottom of this slide, on the other hand, they can generate events for anomalous traffic behavior. All you have to know is what type of behavior this might be, and that's a much broader scope, right? So you can say, hey, if I see a lot of bytes being sent from A to B, that's probably not good. So you can look for packet flows outside of normal patterns. You can look for, again, those attacks against those high-value hosts, users, and event types. This can help you, again, just raise visibility to events that are already occurring on your network. I have some correlation rule examples here. I'll show you a demo here in a second. So things like new host discovered. So new host discovered is a rule that you can create. I have an example rule It's actually a discovery event that occurs with the normal network discovery process as your devices are detecting traffic on your network. So the new host event occurs anytime a new host is plugged into the network. Now, a typical fairly dynamic network is going to see a lot of those as your laptops or whatever come and go as hosts are plugged in and removed. Anytime a new one is plugged in and gets an IP address or starts talking on the network, as soon as it starts talking, if we look in the database, we don't have a record for that host, we're going to generate a new host event. On a very static network, such as at a utility or a control network of some sort, those are fairly static and you don't have hosts coming and going from them all the time. This is a type of event that if you're really very concerned and you have a static network and you want to get a good eye on what's going on, if a new host shows up, you can generate an event for that. Sensitive host security events, I talked about those a little bit already. Endpoint malware-based events, those are huge. Those happen, and if you can add actually again additional notification to an event like that. Unusually large flow. I'll show you rules that have an example of that. A sinkhole connection attempt, right? So if you have a DNS sinkhole where you are sending your clients to this sinkhole when they try to go to some evil type of site, right? So a lot of times we'll have a security intelligence event. This may be a command and control or a botnet, whatever type of event. We're going to spoof a DNS response to the client. That spoofed DNS response is going to redirect the client to a sinkhole IP. We can then detect that sinkhole IP activity via connection event and use a correlation rule to raise an alert. And then lastly, if executives are targeted or any high value user is targeted, you could write correlation as rules. So these are just examples. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of more different ways and types of correlation rules you can write. So my goal here is to show you what you can do to get you to start thinking about it and to write some correlation rules of your own. With that, let's get to the demo. So I'm looking at a 6.7 FMC, but any version of Firewall will work. So let's go up to policies and over to correlation. So the way this works is there are rules and policies. The rules are the things we create that describe the activities or the events that we want to trigger on. The policy then takes those rules and ties it to a response, such as again, an email, SNMP, syslog, or a customer mediation response. You can also just generate a correlation event, which is another type of event, but usually those are linked up with some other response as well. So we don't start with the policy, we start with the rules. So let's go over and look at some rules. So the system ships without any correlation rules. However, I've written a number of them here as examples. The sky is the limit, and you're limited only by your own imagination on what types of rules you can put in there to try to look for types of activity that you might like to know about. So let me start with one at the top, called it critical infrastructure attacks. Now, this critical infrastructure attacks rule is designed to look for attacks against, well, what we call critical infrastructure. So first of all, this rule is going to trigger on an intrusion event. So when you write a correlation rule on the first if line here at the top, this is that if this, right? If this, then that. So this whole rule is the if this, the that is what's going to happen in the policy. So if an intrusion event occurs, so you could pick intrusion, discovery, a number of different types of events or activities here. So I went with intrusion event for this one. So I said if an intrusion event occurs, and then you can add conditions. What about that event? Well, there's a lot of things you can look at inside an intrusion event. Anywhere from impact flag to what policy was the event in, what the generator ID is. So if you look for a specific rule, you could say look for the rule SID here. But in this case, I'm looking for any intrusion rule with an impact flag of 2 or greater. So those basically be 1 or 2, so red or orange impact. So fairly impactful events to these hosts. So if an intrusion event occurs, and then down below here, my host profile qualification. So what I've done is I've set up a host profile that is a custom host profile for my host. So I've added an attribute, called it compliance type, and then I've populated that on my high value hosts. So you can see I have 3 compliance types I've listed here: SOX, HIPAA, GLBA, just for some regulations so that might match some different hosts. So what I've said is if I get an impact 2 or greater intrusion event and the source or destination host has one of these flags set on it, SOX, HIPAA, or GLBA, then that's going to trigger this rule. And the idea is I want to be alerted when I get an intrusion event on one of these high value hosts. Back at the list, let's look down a little bit. Here's one that I used before, and that is new host discovered. So the new host discovered event, it's a fairly simple one. There's only one condition in here now, and we could add more, but in this case, what I've said is the new host discovered event occurs. It's a discovery event, and this occurs anytime there's a new host on the network. So you can see it's a discovery event type. If you look at the events available for discovery, there are a number of different types here, and I've just picked the new IP host detected. What I've done is I said, okay, if I get a discovery event that has new host detected, and again, we can add conditions. So what conditions can we add? Well, these are the kind of conditions you can add from a discovery event. So in this case, I'm going to say, okay, if the IP is in a certain range, and this might be any type of network you want to select, like an IoT network or a DMZ, it doesn't matter. Another interesting rule is one I call outbound IP-based SI. So this is for security intelligence events. Now the thing about security intelligence events is they are classified as connection events. So if you look in this event type here, we don't have a security intelligence event type. We do have a connection event type. If the connection event has a security intelligence category, that makes it a security intelligence event. The purpose of this is to alert me anytime there's an IP-based security intelligence event that is an outbound event. So as we know, security intelligence has a list. So for instance, in the IP security intelligence, it just says these IPs are in a certain list, command and control, bots, you name it. There's a bunch of categories. Any connection to or from that IP address is going to trigger the event. So you don't know, it could be an inbound event. It could be something that is classified as CNC server that is also trying to conduct some attacks, and it hits your firewall and triggers a CNC event. Well, you might want to look at that. You might rush to look at that and go, oh, that's an inbound event. I don't really care about that one. This is a good way where you can say, I only care about outbound security intelligence events, and maybe even in certain categories. So what I've done, again, connection event, and I've said there's a security intelligence category. And again, there are a lot of things about a connection event here. You can see just a ton of things. So lots of different options. But I said security intelligence category is in, which means it's one of these. So when you have an is in, you can put a number of things in there. So I took a number of the security intelligence categories that I thought were higher value, higher risk, and I said, okay, if I get a security intelligence event that's in this category, one of these categories, and the responder IP is not in my network. So this is my network. So I said the responder IP is not. I could have said the initiator IP is in, either way. But this is where I'm getting an event, but I know it's an outbound event because the responder is not in my network. Another type of event I've created here is called executive leadership IPS events. Let's take a look at that one. So here's an event. Again, it's an intrusion event. So you can see select the type. It's an intrusion event. Impact flag here, I say, well, let's make it 3 or greater. So 1, 2, or 3 impact. And then I put a user identity qualification on this. So this says the identity of the source or the destination, and IP here. I don't know which one's going to be which here. I want to make sure I'm covered either way for these executive events. So if I have an intrusion event and the source or the destination is the department is ELT for executive leadership team, then I want to trigger this rule. The department here is part of an attribute you can get from a typical Active Directory or any LDAP, but typically Active Directory. These fields are in the Active Directory record. So if you've tied this to Active Directory at all through your ICE or ICE-PIC server, the FMC will actually pull from the domain controller this information out of the directory. So if the directory department is populated in your Active Directory, from that department you can tell who the employee is, whether they're a targeted group like this one, then you can use that. So I've said, okay, all my ELT has ELT in their department. So if their department says ELT, then I want to trigger this. The last example event I want to bring to your attention is one I call unusually large DB connection. Now this one's especially exciting to me because this one is the one that you can use to profile network traffic and look for specific types of behavior. And this is something, again, I just kind of made this one up out of the blue and out of something out of my imaginary network. But if you have a real network you're protecting and you have real hosts, real issues, and real threats, which we all do, then this may be something that you can just start thinking about and thinking of ways to write rules that can look for this type of activity. So what this is, and we're triggering off a connection event here, and we're saying, okay, the initiator IP is a certain IP. So let me scroll up so you can see all these. Okay, so we've got the initiator IP at the top, and it says the initiator IP is 10.0.0.9. So that is, in my scenario here, that's a web server that sits in a web DMZ. So that one's going to be contacted from the external internet. It's going to provide services to users out there. And again, this could be sitting in the public cloud somewhere too. We can manage these devices anywhere, right? So it doesn't have to be on your network. It could be a public device, public cloud container instance there. So that's your web front end. The responder IP back here, the second IP is a database back end. So what I've added here is called a connection tracker. So this is going to look for a connection event where the initiator IP is this database, or sorry, this web server, and the responder IP is this backend database server. And again, these could be ranges too. It could be an entire range. It could be a subnet range here and a range back here, not to be individual IPs. When it has a connection that matches this criteria, then it's going to start a connection tracker and say, okay, I'm going to start tracking that connection. What we said here is generate an event if I said the total responder bytes are greater than 1 million. So again, we can look at a number of attributes about that connection with a connection tracker, unique initiators, responders, total bytes, etc. But I'm really interested in responder bytes here. So the scenario here is that this web server will typically query this backend database server with some sensitive data on it, but the queries will be short. They'll be responded to because of a web request on a web page. Maybe somebody wants some information. They've logged in securely, looking at their bank account or something. Who knows? They'll get some data off of it, right? But it's going to be short packets, short connections. So what we're looking for here is a situation where that web server makes a connection to the database server, but instead of just pulling a little small amount of data, it's now pulled a megabyte of data. So it's pulled a megabyte of data and in a single connection over a 5-minute period. And then we can change that, of course, to whatever makes sense. But the point is, that's much larger than a typical transaction between this web server and the database server. This should really never happen. Now, it didn't trigger any rules. There's no signature rule for this. Probably this connection is encrypted anyway, so there's a good chance we can't see a lot of what's going on inside it. But the point is, we don't need to see what's inside it. We've seen something that's quite unusual now. If a megabyte of data is now getting sent from that database server, probably honestly through that web server, off to be exfiltrated somewhere else. So this is an excellent way. Just look for a type of behavior on the network to say, that's a big connection, that's too long, that should not be happening. And you can do the same thing for any of those sensitive servers, even to say, hey, if I see a sensitive server start sending data anywhere outside my network, you can write a rule for that. Once you've created some rules, let me show you quickly how you can put those together with a policy. So we're here still on rule management. We'll go over here to policy management. Now I have a couple policies I've already created, but this system won't come with any policies. You can create a new policy, of course, and add your rules to it. I'm going to just take a look at one I already have. I call it actionable events. Now this policy already has a few rule to response mappings in it. And honestly, they don't have to have anything to do with each other. So I've got one for the endpoint-based malware, internal host initiating a CNC, new host discovered, but they're basically standalone. It's saying if this happens, this is the if this then that, right? So if this, the rule triggers, then do this. So to add a new rule, for instance, I would click Add Rules. I want to pick my unusually large DB connection rule here. I can add that in. Now each one of the rules above only has one response with it. This one doesn't have any yet. You can add more than one if you want those. So if we go over here to the little responses balloon here, these are all the responses on my system. And responses are defined really as your alerts, which are going to be syslog, SNMP, or email. Or Nmap remediation is another alert response. So anything that is a remediation or an alert can be a response. So I can say I'm going to email myself here. You can actually run a remediation as well. You can do a syslog as well. So you can do a number of responses if you want. So in this case, if this happens, I'm going to get 4 things. I'm going to get a couple of alerts, a couple of responses. So you can mix and match there. And once we're done there, we're going to save that. Now, one last thing to remember about correlation policy is that it's not a policy that's deployed to devices. So there's no deploy needed after this. Once I've set up correlation rules and policies, they just start working. The only thing you need to do is turn them on. So when you first create a policy, this little switch is going to be off. So if I created a new policy, the last step would be to come back to this screen and simply turn the switch on the policy. But there's no deploy needed. Nothing needs to happen on your devices. So again, I'll just flip the switch. That's it. So no device impact, no deploy, because this all happens on the FMC. The devices are just sending the data, the connections and events, other things that the FMC is using to correlate to generate these events. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of this video. I hope that inspires some of you to go out there and take a look at correlation rules, come up with some rules that'll work for your environment, and catch the bad guys in the act. As usual, thanks for watching and happy snorting.